There are two fundamental mistakes people often make in this world. They overestimate the value of things that glitter, and they grossly underestimate the power that lies dormant in silence. It was a lesson that my wife's family was about to learn, a lesson they would pay for, not with money, but with the very foundations of their arrogant world. The story begins on a night in rural Oregon, under the weight of a relentless, chilling downpour, the kind of rain that seems to wash the color from the world, leaving only shades of gray and black. Outside his own kitchen window, hidden by the weeping branches of an old willow tree, stood Ethan. He was a man of the earth, his hands calloused from work, not weakness, his spirit quiet but not empty. Inside, in a bubble of warmth and light that felt a universe away, sat his wife, Sarah, her brother, Mark, and their mother, Eleanor. They believed he was in town, delayed by the storm while picking up supplies. They were wrong. He had come home early, guided by a knot of unease in his gut he couldn't explain. And now, he was listening. He heard Mark's voice first, dripping with a familiar condescension, calling him that foolish farmer, clinging desperately to his grandfather's useless patch of dirt. He heard Eleanor's sigh, a sound of perpetual disappointment, as she lamented how her daughter had wasted her prime years on a man with no ambition. But the deepest cut, the one that severed the last thread of the life he knew, came from his wife. Sarah laughed. It was a laugh he had once loved, a sound he thought was reserved for him. Now it was like shattering glass in the cold night air. "Let him play with his mud," she said, her voice light and cruel. "He'll have to sell soon enough. I am so tired of pretending to be happy." Then Mark mentioned her lover, the wealthy man waiting for her in the city, and their plan was laid bare. Ethan's world did not explode, it simply ceased to exist. The man standing in the rain felt nothing, and in that nothingness, a terrifying clarity emerged. He didn't burst through the door. He didn't scream in rage. He simply backed away, melting back into the shadows that had concealed him. The rain on his face felt no colder than the ice forming in his veins. The storm outside was loud and violent, but it was nothing compared to the storm that had just been unleashed within him. But this storm was silent, it was patient, and it was methodical. The man who walked away from that window was not the same man who had arrived home moments before. The loving husband was gone, a ghost left behind in the mud and the rain. In his place stood something new, something forged in the absolute certainty of betrayal, a man who had lost everything, and therefore had absolutely nothing left to lose. A betrayal of this magnitude is never a single event. It is not a sudden clap of thunder from a clear sky. No, it is a structure built meticulously over time, brick by painful brick, lie by poisonous lie. To understand the cold, calculated silence of the man in the rain, you must first understand the house of deceit he had been living in, a house whose foundations were laid long before he ever suspected its existence. The story of Ethan and Sarah had begun, as many do, with an intoxicating illusion of opposites attracting. He was the quiet, steady man from the country, his character as solid and dependable as the ancient oaks that bordered his property. He carried the scent of rich earth and hard work, a stark contrast to the cologne and ambition of the city men Sarah knew. She, in turn, was a flash of vibrant color in his monochrome world, full of laughter, stories of a life he'd never known, and a restless energy that he found captivating. For a short, beautiful time, they believed their differences were their strength. He grounded her, and she made him look up at the stars. He inherited his farm, not as a business, but as a sacred trust from the grandfather who had raised him. Every fence post, every stone in the creek bed, held a memory. It was his history and his future, the one piece of the world that made perfect sense to him. Sarah had professed to love this, to admire his connection to something so real. She called it romantic. But romance, for some, has an expiration date. The first bricks of the foundation were laid when Sarah brought Ethan home to meet her family. Her brother, Mark, was everything Ethan was not. Dressed in a sharp suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly earnings, he had the slick, predatory smile of a man who saw the world as a series of transactions. He shook Ethan's hand, but his eyes were assessing, judging, and dismissing him all in one glance. "A farmer," Mark had said. drawing the word out as if it were an exotic, slightly amusing species. How authentic. Their mother, Eleanor, was a woman carved from ice, her warmth reserved only for those who could elevate her social standing. She appraised Ethan's simple clothes, his calloused hands, and offered a smile so thin it could have cut glass. From that day forward, Ethan was not a person to them. He was a project, a problem, a living symbol of their daughter's questionable life choices. And Sarah, caught between the man she thought she loved and the family whose approval she craved, began the slow, corrosive process of compromise. She started with small lies, to herself and to him. "They just don't understand you yet," she would say, or "Mark's just joking. That's his way." She became an interpreter of their insults, softening the blows, explaining away the condescension. She was, in effect, plastering over the cracks in a foundation she refused to admit was failing. The family dinners became Ethan's personal crucible. He would sit at their polished dining table, feeling as out of place as a wild bird in a gilded cage. Mark would dominate the conversation with tales of his latest real estate conquest, of leveraging assets and crushing competitors. Eleanor would inquire about Ethan's farm, but the questions were always loaded. "Is it profitable, dear?" she'd ask, the unspoken implication being that it was, of course, a failing enterprise. "Are you able to provide Sarah with the things she deserves?" Ethan would try to share his own world, speaking of the satisfaction of a successful harvest, the birth of a new calf, the simple beauty of a sunrise over his fields. But his words would land on deaf ears, met with blank stares or a polite, dismissive nod, before Mark would steer the conversation back to the only topic that mattered: money. Sarah would sit beside him, silent. Her silence was the most painful part. She never defended him. She never validated his world. She would just shrink a little in her chair, her discomfort a tangible thing in the air between them. Her silence was her complicity. It was the mortar holding the bricks of their deceit together. Then came Mark's offers, disguised as acts of familial concern. He would corner Ethan during holidays, an arm slung over his shoulder in a gesture of false camaraderie. "Look, Ethan," he'd begin, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm worried about you. I'm worried about my sister. This farming life, it's a noble idea, but it's a relic of the past. You're barely scraping by. You're tying Sarah to a sinking ship." He would then present his offer, an insultingly low figure for the land, painting it as a lifeline. "Let me take this burden off your hands. I can develop it, build a beautiful golf resort. You and Sarah could have a fresh start, a real life, with real money." Each time, Ethan would politely but firmly decline. He would try to explain that the farm's value wasn't in dollars, but in legacy, in soul. His refusal was always met with a shake of the head from Mark, a look of pity that said, "I tried to help this fool, but he's beyond saving." To the family, Ethan's loyalty to his heritage was not seen as honorable, but as stubborn, stupid, and selfish. He wasn't just holding on to a farm. He was holding Sarah back from the life they believed she was entitled to. As the years passed, Sarah's quiet complicity curdled into open resentment. The farm was no longer our home, but your land. His work was no longer noble, but dirty. She spent more and more time in the city, returning with expensive clothes and a discontent that filled every corner of their small house. She spoke of her friends' European vacations, their new cars, their kitchen renovations. Every word was a comparison, and in every comparison, Ethan was the one who fell short. He was the anchor holding her down while all the other ships sailed for glamorous horizons. He tried to bridge the growing chasm between them, suggesting they invest in new equipment or diversify their crops. But he was speaking a language she no longer wanted to understand. Her gaze was fixed on a world beyond his fields, a world promised to her by her family, a world where value was measured in bank statements and social status. Ethan, meanwhile, found solace where he always had, in the land itself. He would walk the fields his grandfather had walked, remembering the old man's simple, profound wisdom. "This land doesn't lie, son," his grandfather used to say, his hands deep in the soil. "It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. You give to it, and it gives back. People aren't always so honest." He had never understood how true those words were until now. He had been so focused on cultivating his land, he had failed to see the weeds of deceit growing in his own home, choking the life out of everything he held dear. And so, on that rainy night, as he stood listening to the casual destruction of his life, he finally understood. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a revelation. He was finally seeing the true architecture of his marriage, the foundation of lies that had been there all along. And he knew, with a certainty as deep and cold as the well on his property, that he was the only one who could bring the whole rotten structure crashing to the ground. A lie, you see, has a certain weight. It is an invisible thing, yet it presses down on the air in a room. It changes the resonance of a familiar voice. It leaves a cold spot on a shared bed. For months, Ethan had been living with this pressure, this subtle but constant sense of wrongness. He had tried to ignore it, attributing it to his own fatigue, to the stress of running the farm, to the endless, subtle poison dripped into his ears by his wife's family. He had chosen to believe in the reality he wanted, the one he had built with his own two hands. But denial is a dam made of sand, and the truth is a relentless river. Eventually, the cracks begin to appear, small at first, then spreading into fissures, until the entire structure is poised to collapse. The first visible crack appeared in the form of a telephone. It was a Tuesday evening, and he had come in from the barn later than usual, the scent of hay and honest sweat clinging to his clothes. Sarah was on the phone in the living room, her back to the door. Her voice was different, a low, intimate murmur, punctuated by a soft, genuine laugh he hadn't heard directed at him in years. The moment he stepped over the threshold, her entire body tensed. The warmth in her voice vanished, replaced by a flat, business-like tone. "Okay, I have to go," she said quickly, not looking at him. "I'll talk to you later." She hung up and turned, a startled, almost guilty look flashing in her eyes before being replaced by a cool mask of indifference. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice calm, casual. "Oh, just Jessica from the office," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "You know, complaining about her boss again." It was a plausible lie, a simple one, but it felt wrong. It felt rehearsed. He knew what her voice sounded like when she spoke to Jessica, and that wasn't it. He said nothing more, but the lie settled in the air between them, heavy and cold. The next crack was a piece of paper. A few weeks later, while cleaning out the passenger side of their truck, a folded receipt fell from the sun visor. His heart gave a painful thud before he even read it. It was from the Grand Sterling Hotel in the city, one of the most expensive establishments around. The charge was for a couple's Serenity Spa package, and it included champagne and a private suite. The date was from a weekend, 3 weeks prior, a weekend she had supposedly spent at a mandatory, all-expenses-paid marketing seminar. He stood there in the driveway, the flimsy piece of paper feeling like a block of ice in his hand. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, but a wintry chill was spreading through his chest. That evening, he confronted her, not with anger, but with a quiet, wounded confusion. He held out the receipt. "I thought your seminar was at the conference center," he said. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal. Panic flickered in her eyes. But Sarah was a survivor, and her best defense was a vicious offense. Her fear instantly hardened into indignation. "Are you serious?" she snapped, snatching the paper from his hand. "You're going through my things now?" "A few of the girls from work and I decided to treat ourselves after the seminar was over." "My God, Ethan, are we not allowed to have one nice thing? Do you have to question every single dollar that isn't spent on fertilizer or fence posts?" She turned it back on him, masterfully painting him as a controlling, suspicious husband, jealous of her small taste of luxury. He found himself apologizing, retreating from the force of her anger, even though every instinct in his body screamed that he was being played. He wanted to believe her. It was so much less painful to believe he was paranoid than to believe he was a fool. And so he lived in that agonizing space between suspicion and hope, replaying her explanations in his mind, trying to make them fit, trying to patch the cracks that just kept getting wider. He began to seek refuge not in his house, which no longer felt like a home, but in the barn. The old structure was his sanctuary, a cathedral of timber and time. It smelled of his grandfather, of old leather, sweet hay, and faint, lingering pipe tobacco. It was a place of uncomplicated truth, where work was honest and the past was a comforting presence. One afternoon, overwhelmed by the suffocating weight of his doubts, he was clearing out a forgotten corner of the hayloft, a space that hadn't been touched in years. His hands brushed against a heavy, dust-covered wooden chest. He pried open the rusted latch, and inside, nestled amongst old photographs and his grandfather's whittling tools, was a thick, leather-bound journal. He ran his thumb over the worn cover. It felt like shaking his grandfather's hand. He took it down from the loft, sat on a bale of hay as golden afternoon light streamed through the gaps in the barn walls, and he began to read. The entries were written in his grandfather's strong, clear script, a farmer's log of seasons, crops, and life. But woven amongst the notes on rainfall and harvests was something else. He found the first mention under an entry from the spring of 1978. The old mare, Bess, her front leg has been stiff for a month. The vet can do little. Today, I let her stand in the warm spring at the back of the property for an hour. She seemed to favor the leg less afterward, a foolish old man's hope, perhaps. But the entries continued. A few weeks later, have been letting Bess stand in the spring water every day. She is moving easier than she has in years. There is a warmth to that water that goes deeper than the skin. Another entry, years later. Slashed my hand open on a piece of rusty barbed wire. Cleaned it in the house, but it began to fester. Remembered the old stories. Soaked it in the spring for 20 minutes. The angry red color was gone by morning. The old folks called it the healing stream. Perhaps they were not just telling stories. He read on, mesmerized. His grandfather had chronicled how the tomatoes he watered from the spring grew larger and resisted blight, how the patch of wild mint near its edge was the most potent he'd ever tasted. It was not a language of science, but of careful, patient observation. This was his grandfather's secret, a quiet piece of wonder on a piece of land everyone else had dismissed as ordinary. Ethan closed the journal, the smell of old paper and ink filling his senses. In his mind, he saw the slick, condescending smile on his brother-in-law's face. He heard his wife's manufactured explanations and her cold, dismissive tone. He felt the suffocating weight of their lies, their ambition, their contempt, and here, in his hands, he held a truth. A simple, earthy, undeniable truth written in the hand of the most honest man he had ever known. He didn't yet understand what it meant. He had no idea of its monetary value, of the power it held. At that moment, it was simply a story, a connection to a past that was pure. But as he sat there in the quiet of the barn, a seed was planted in the fertile ground of his sorrow. The cracks in his marriage had revealed a hollow, rotten core. But this journal, this stream, it suggested that the cracks in the earth, the secrets hidden on his own land, might just hold the foundation for something new. He didn't know where the path was leading, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was holding a map. There is a certain kind of truth that doesn't just present itself, it arrives like a home invasion. It kicks down the door of your denial, shatters the windows of your hope, and rearranges the furniture of your soul, leaving you in a wreckage of what you once believed to be your life. Ethan was about to experience such an invasion. It began, as these things often do, with a splinter of doubt, a small, nagging inconsistency. Sarah had told him she was going to her book club that evening, at a friend's house clear on the other side of the county. But earlier that day, Ethan had called that very friend to ask about a good place to buy seed, and when he'd casually mentioned he'd see her husband at a town meeting the next night, she'd said, "Oh, we'll both be there. We're having a quiet night in tonight." A simple slip, a meaningless confusion perhaps, but in the fragile landscape of Ethan's growing suspicion, it was a tremor. It was enough. He finished his business in town early, the excuse he'd given Sarah for being late now a useful fiction. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, a torrential downpour that turned the country roads into slick ribbons of black. As he turned onto the long gravel lane that led to his farm, his headlights swept across something that didn't belong. A sleek, silver sedan. parked awkwardly in a small clearing 100 yards from his house. Mark's car. A wave of nausea and cold dread washed over him. Why would Mark be here on a stormy Tuesday night when Sarah was supposed to be miles away? He killed his engine and his lights, plunging the lane into darkness. He got out of his truck, the mud sucking at his boots, and began to walk, using the cover of the ancient pines that lined the road. He approached his own home like a thief, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The house was lit up, and through the rain-streaked kitchen window, he could see them, Mark, Eleanor, and Sarah. There was no book club. There was only a tribunal, and he was the one on trial. He crept closer, concealed by the darkness and the weeping willow his grandfather had planted. The sound of their voices was faint at first, muffled by the glass and the roar of the rain. But then he heard a burst of laughter, sharp and clear. It was Sarah's. It was the sound that drew him in, the sound that would ultimately condemn her. He pressed himself against the wet siding of the house, positioning himself just beside the window, and he listened. "I'm telling you, it was perfect," Mark was saying, his voice thick with self-congratulation. "I just had to make one little phone call to that organic distributor in Portland. I told them a concerned neighbor had spotted some worrying signs of a potential pest problem on the farm. They dropped his contract within the hour. He was so defeated when he told me. It was all I could do not to laugh in his face." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. His biggest contract, the one that would have secured their finances for the entire year, gone. It hadn't been bad luck. It hadn't been a poor inspection. It had been sabotage. A deliberate, calculated blow from his own family. Eleanor's voice, cool and precise, cut through his shock. "It's a necessary cruelty, Mark. The man is stubborn. He will never let go of this land out of sentiment alone. He must be broken. He is holding Sarah back from the life she deserves. A man content to play in the dirt is no husband for a daughter of mine." Then came Sarah's voice, and every word was a nail in the coffin of the life they had built. "He'll be begging you to buy the place within a month," she said, and he could hear the smile in her words. "And Julian is getting impatient. He wants me to move into the city penthouse with him as soon as this is all settled." Julian. The name landed like a physical blow. The faceless lover now had a name. "What about the money?" Mark asked. "Is there enough to tide you over?" "I took care of it," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been moving money from our joint savings to a private account for months. The final transfer went through today. He'll never even notice it's gone. He trusts me that much." She paused, and then she delivered the final, fatal strike, the words that would echo in his soul forever. "The poor, simple fool." In that moment, the world stopped. The sound of the rain, the pounding of his own heart, the hum of the refrigerator inside it all vanished. The universe narrowed to the illuminated rectangle of that kitchen window, a diorama of his own personal hell. The pain was so vast, so absolute, that it bypassed anger and went straight to a place of terrible, silent clarity. He was no longer a husband. He was a witness. He was no longer a victim. He was a judge. The rain soaking his clothes was no longer cold. He felt nothing. The man he had been, the trusting, patient, loving man, had just been executed in absentia. And he, the shell that remained, had heard the verdict. He backed away from the window, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man walking in a dream. He did not stumble. He did not make a sound. He walked back through the mud and the driving rain, each step an eternity, and got into his truck. He didn't start it right away. He just sat there, staring at the house, his house, now a monument to a life that was a lie. He started the engine, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead quiet of his new reality, and he drove away. He didn't go far. He drove to the top of Miller's Ridge, an overlook that gave a panoramic view of his entire farm. It was a place his grandfather had often taken him as a boy to teach him the contours of the land. Now he looked down upon it, a patchwork of dark fields and darker woods, and saw it not as a home, but as a chessboard. He sat there all night, motionless, as the storm raged, and then, finally, exhausted itself. He didn't sleep. He didn't weep. He watched. When the first, pale fingers of dawn began to probe the eastern sky, the rain had stopped. A clean, cold light washed over the landscape, illuminating everything with a stark, unforgiving clarity. It was the same clarity he now felt in his own mind. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his gut, but it was no longer chaotic. It had been forged by the long, dark hours into something else. Something hard, something sharp, something patient. The sun rose, and it was not a promise of a new day, but a declaration of a new era. The era of the simple fool was over. The era of the silent storm was about to begin. He put the truck in gear and started down the hill, his course as clear and certain as the morning sky. Grief is an ocean. For most, it comes in waves, crashing down with violent emotion before receding, allowing a moment to breathe before the next assault. But for Ethan, the grief was different. It was not a wave, but a sudden, bottomless trench that opened beneath him, a plunge into a darkness so absolute and cold that it extinguished the very fire of his rage. In that profound abyss, there was no room for screaming, no space for tears. There was only a terrifying, preternatural calm. He returned to the house as the sun was cresting the hills, the morning light doing little to dispel the shadows that now lived behind his eyes. Sarah was in the kitchen, her back to him, humming a tune as she made coffee. She turned, a flicker of annoyance on her face. "My God, where have you been? You're covered in mud." "I was worried," she said, though her tone sounded more like an accusation. He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her not as his wife, but as a stranger, a well-rehearsed actress playing a part. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the faint lines of discontent around her mouth. He saw the enemy. The old Ethan, the man who existed just yesterday, would have confronted her. He would have thrown her words back in her face, his voice cracking with pain and anger. And she would have weathered it. She and her family would have labeled him hysterical, unstable, confirming their narrative that he was an emotional, simple man, incapable of rational thought. They would have absorbed his fury, and it would have changed nothing. The new Ethan understood this with chilling certainty. A loud, messy confrontation was their game, played on their terms. It was a release of pressure that would ultimately leave them in control. His justice would not be loud. It would be silent. It would be invisible. It would grow in the dark, like the roots of a mighty oak, until it was strong enough to shatter the very foundations of their world. He spent the day in a fugue state, performing his chores with the numb precision of a machine. He mended a fence, fed the livestock, cleared a fallen branch from the lane. With every physical task, his mind was working, turning over the pieces of the previous night, analyzing them not as a wounded husband, but as a general studying a battlefield. He dissected his opponents. Mark was a creature of pure ego, his confidence built on a flimsy scaffolding of quick deals and intimidation. He craved the appearance of success. Eleanor was a worshiper at the altar of social status. Public perception was her god. And Sarah was a ghost, haunted by the life she felt she was owed, desperate to trade authenticity for luxury. Their weaknesses were glaring. They worshipped the same trinity: money, status, and power. And he realized, with a clarity that was almost terrifying, that to truly defeat them, he couldn't simply expose their lies. He had to become the very thing they adored, and then deny them access to it. He had to build an empire on the land they despised, and then, from its ramparts, watch their world crumble into dust. The goal was no longer to heal his heart. The goal was to dismantle theirs. That afternoon, he found himself back in the barn, the scent of old wood and earth, a welcome balm to his fractured soul. He retrieved his grandfather's journal. This time, he did not read it for comfort or for a connection to the past. He read it as a prospector reading a treasure map. He turned to the pages detailing the healing stream, his eyes scanning the simple, honest prose for data. The water is always warm, even on the coldest winter day. A geothermal source. It leaves a fine, silky powder on the rocks when it dries. Mineral deposits. Old man Hemlock's dog, crippled with joint pains, would always lie in the shallows and seem to walk easier for days after. Anecdotal evidence of therapeutic properties. The journal was no longer a collection of memories. It was a business plan, a seed, and Ethan knew it was time to see if that seed could grow in the scorched earth of his life. The next morning, he woke before dawn. He took 3 sterile glass bottles from a home canning kit and walked to the back of the property. The mist was thick, clinging to the low-lying fields in a ghostly shroud. He came to the place where the stream emerged from a rocky outcrop, steam rising from its surface in the cool morning air. For a moment, he paused, remembering himself as a boy, splashing in this very water, his grandfather watching from the bank with a gentle smile. A pang of the old grief, a phantom pain from a life that was already gone, echoed in his chest. He pushed it down. Sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford. He was not here to remember. He was here to extract. He knelt, the wet earth cold against his knees, and carefully filled each bottle, the water warm against his skin. He sealed them, labeled them with a simple code, and placed them in a small, insulated box. Back in his workshop, surrounded by the comforting, honest smell of sawdust and oil, he sat at his old, dusty laptop. He didn't search for local labs. The risk of a connection to his family, however small, was too great. He searched for discrete geological and water analysis, and after an hour of cross-referencing and reading reviews, he found his target, a highly respected, independent laboratory in Denver, Colorado. They specialized in mineral prospecting and offered confidential services. Using a prepaid credit card he kept for emergencies, he paid for their most comprehensive analysis package. He filled out the submission form, and in the space for the client's name, he paused. Ethan Miller, the simple farmer, was a dead man. It was time for a new identity to be born. He typed the name Michael Stone. It was plain, solid, and unremarkable. It was the name of a ghost. The final piece of his plan required his last secret. In his grandfather's old bedroom, he lifted a loose floorboard near the fireplace, a hiding place the old man had shown him as a boy. Inside was a small metal box containing $500 in cash, a relic of a time when people believed in keeping something tangible, something real. It was his last reserve, the final safety net between him and utter ruin. Using it was the ultimate act of faith in his plan. It was an all-or-nothing bet. The next day, he drove into town, the insulated box sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. At the post office, he paid for expedited, insured shipping with his dwindling cash. As the clerk placed the fragile sticker on the box and slid it away, Ethan felt a profound sense of finality. The die was cast. Now, all he could do was wait and act. That evening, he began the performance. He sat at the dinner table, pushing food around his plate, his shoulders slumped. He let the silence stretch, filling it with a carefully crafted aura of defeat. Finally, he looked up at Sarah, his eyes hollow. "I was thinking today," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The contract with the distributor. I don't know how we'll recover. I think maybe Mark is right." He saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of triumph in her eyes. A spark of victory she tried desperately to conceal behind a mask of concerned sympathy. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It felt like the touch of a spider. "Oh, honey," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. We'll get through this." He looked at her hand on his, a symbol of the deepest intimacy now repurposed for the most profound deception, and he felt nothing but the cold, hard certainty of his path. The seed of the plan was now planted, and his enemies, in their infinite greed, were about to water it for him. Silence is a canvas. To the careless observer, it is empty, a void of nothingness. But to the patient and the purposeful, it is a space where masterpieces of strategy can be painted, where empires can be designed before a single stone is laid. While Ethan's world appeared to be shrinking into a monochrome portrait of failure, in the silent, hidden studio of his mind, he was beginning to paint his revenge in the most vibrant and lethal colors imaginable. The 2 weeks that followed were the purest form of psychological torture. By day, he was an actor in a tragedy of his own life. He moved with a leaden slowness, his shoulders perpetually slumped. He performed his farm duties with a sigh, allowing a fence to remain slightly crooked, letting the weeds in a fallow field grow a little too high, all under the watchful, satisfied eyes of his wife. Sarah had become a warden of his despair, offering him cups of tea with a cloying sympathy that made his skin crawl. Her pity was a poison she served with a smile, and he drank it down every single day, allowing it to fuel the cold fire that now burned where his heart used to be. Mark began to visit more frequently, circling like a vulture. He would walk the property with a proprietary air, pointing out how a new fairway could run through the west pasture, where the clubhouse could be built overlooking the creek. He'd clap Ethan on the shoulder, his voice a low, friendly growl. "Don't you worry, buddy," he'd say. "I'll make sure you and Sarah are taken care of. My offer is still on the table. It's the only way out." And Ethan would just nod, his eyes downcast, playing the part of the broken man to perfection, all the while wanting to wipe that condescending smirk off his brother-in-law's face with a shovel. Then, on a quiet Thursday night, it arrived. Not as a letter, not as a phone call, but as a sterile, automated email. The subject line contained only a 17-digit case number. The body of the email held a single sentence: "Your analysis is complete and available for viewing on our secure client portal." There was a link, and a string of alphanumeric code that was his temporary password. His heart began to hammer a frantic, powerful rhythm against his ribs. He waited. He sat through a silent dinner. He watched an hour of television he didn't see. He listened to the sound of Sarah getting ready for bed. He waited until the house was completely dark, until the only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant call of a lone coyote. Only then did he walk out to his workshop, lock the door behind him, and sit down in front of his laptop. The air in the small space was thick with anticipation. He typed in the web address, entered the case number, and the long, complicated password. The screen loaded a simple, professional page with a single link. Download report, case number. He clicked it. A password-protected PDF file began to download. The progress bar seemed to move with agonizing slowness. Finally, it finished. He typed the password in again, and the document opened. It was 27 pages of dense, scientific data, chemical tables, and geological charts. He scrolled past them, his eyes searching for the summary. He found it on page 3. He read the first sentence, then read it again, then a third time, letting the words sink in. The sample provided exhibits a unique and unprecedented geothermal mineral composition. Key elements of significant commercial value, including lithium, cesium, and rubidium, are present in concentrations that far exceed any known natural source. He scrolled down further, past the technical jargon, until his eyes landed on a section titled Analyst's Addendum, a personal note from the lab's chief geologist. "To the client, Michael Stone," it began. "I must state for the record that in my 35 years of geological analysis, I have never encountered a sample of this nature. The combination of these specific rare earth elements in such a pure, naturally chelated, and bioavailable form is, frankly, astounding. The water is virtually free of heavy metal contaminants, making its potential applications not only industrial but biomedical. We are talking about a geological anomaly of the highest order. The potential for advanced battery development, specialized pharmaceuticals, and even aerospace applications is, without exaggeration, staggering. I strongly advise you to secure the mineral rights to the source of this sample with the utmost urgency and discretion. You are not sitting on a spring, you are sitting on a paradigm shift." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the squeak of the old wood unnaturally loud in the silence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The numbers, the charts, the geologists' incredulous words, they all coalesced into a single, blinding truth. He wasn't just going to get even. He wasn't just going to be rich. He was about to become a force of nature. His enemies had been playing checkers for pocket change. He was about to overturn the entire board with a game of three-dimensional chess they didn't even know existed. The next morning, he made a phone call. He didn't call a friend or a family member. He called Arthur Vance, a semi-retired lawyer in the city who had been his grandfather's closest friend and estate planner. Arthur was a man from another era, a man whose word was his bond and whose handshake was better than any contract. Ethan drove to the city, the printed report in a sealed envelope on the passenger seat. Arthur's office was a sanctuary of dark wood, leather-bound books, and quiet dignity. He greeted Ethan with a warm but sad smile, expecting a story of financial hardship. Ethan said nothing. He simply slid the envelope across the vast mahogany desk. Arthur put on his reading glasses and began to read. Ethan watched as the old lawyer's expression shifted from polite interest to deep concentration, to utter, slack-jawed astonishment. He read the entire report twice, then took off his glasses and stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. "My God, son," he whispered. "Do you understand what this is?" "I think so," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But I need help. I need to protect it, and I need to be invisible." A slow, fierce smile spread across Arthur's face. "Your grandfather was the most honorable man I ever knew. The vultures who are trying to steal his legacy from you, they won't know what hit them. We are going to build a fortress around this, Ethan. An invisible, impenetrable fortress." And so began Ethan's double life. By day, he was the failing farmer, a tragic figure of obsolescence. His conversations with Sarah were short and despondent. He listened to her thinly veiled suggestions that he call Mark, that he accept the offer and salvage what's left of his dignity. But by night, his workshop became a war room. The dusty laptop was now a gateway to a new world. He engaged in encrypted video calls with Arthur, their conversations weaving through the complex worlds of patent law, corporate structuring, and mineral rights legislation. He devoured books on business management and market analysis. He learned about shell corporations, holding companies, and blind trusts. The man who spent his days covered in mud and grease spent his nights becoming a razor-sharp legal and financial strategist. On Arthur's advice, they formed a Delaware corporation, a ghost in the legal machine. They needed a name. Ethan thought of his grandfather, of the land's quiet nobility that had been mistaken for simplicity. He chose Ethel Springs LLC. Ethel, an Old English word for noble. It was a silent tribute, a secret declaration of his purpose. One late night, Arthur sent him the final digital paperwork. The certificate of incorporation for Ethel Springs LLC glowed on his screen. It was real. A legal entity, with its own existence, its own power. It was his shield. It was his sword. He was no longer just Ethan Miller, the simple farmer. He was the sole, silent owner of a company whose potential was limitless. The ascent had begun, and the air was getting thin. But from this new height, he could see his targets clearly, blissfully unaware in the valley below, laughing at the slow, quiet man who was about to cause an avalanche. An effective trap is a work of art. The amateur lays a crude snare, hoping a victim will stumble into it. The master, however, does something far more elegant. The master builds a beautiful, inviting cage, leaves the door wide open, and convinces his target that entering it is their own brilliant idea. Ethan was no longer a farmer. He had become an artist, and the masterpiece he was creating was a cage forged from his enemies' own greed, baited with their arrogance, and sprung by their unshakable belief in his stupidity. The performance began on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after he had received the report from Colorado. The waiting had been a necessary torment, allowing time for his corporate and legal fortresses to be built by Arthur Vance. Now, it was time to set the bait. He chose the barn as his stage. He knew Sarah often came out around mid-afternoon to call him for a coffee break she insisted on maintaining as part of their charade of normalcy. He took out his phone, dialed his own voicemail, and began a one-sided conversation, his voice a perfect symphony of despair. "I understand," he said, his voice cracking. "No, I know the payments are late. I just thought with the new crop." He paused, listening to the silence on the other end, his eyes fixed on the barn door. "Foreclosure? You're saying foreclosure is the next step?" He let his voice rise in panic, then fall in utter resignation. There are no other options. I understand." He ended the fake call and slumped onto a hay bale, burying his face in his hands, a perfect sculpture of a broken man. Right on cue, the barn door creaked open. It was Sarah. She stood there for a moment, and in that moment, he felt, rather than saw, the cold, triumphant gleam in her eyes. It was quickly replaced by a mask of deep concern. "Ethan? Honey, what is it? What's wrong?" He looked up, his eyes wide with practiced anguish. "The bank," he choked out. "It's over, Sarah. We're going to lose everything." The news spread through their small, venomous family like wildfire. Sarah's call to Mark must have been immediate. That evening, Mark's sleek sedan once again pulled into the gravel drive. This time, he didn't approach with the swagger of a vulture, but with the solemn, predatory calm of an undertaker. He found Ethan on the porch, staring blankly at the fields. "Sarah told me the news," Mark said, his voice a low, soothing purr that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Listen to me, Ethan. This isn't the end of the world. I told you I'd be there for you. My offer still stands. I can make a call to my guy at the bank, get them to hold off the foreclosure proceedings. I can take this whole mess off your hands. You can walk away with some cash in your pocket and your dignity intact." The word dignity, from this man's lips, was the foulest of insults. But Ethan just looked at him with hollow eyes and nodded slowly. I need to think about it," he whispered. This feigned hesitation was crucial. It was the wiggle on the fishing line, the sign to the predator that the prey was hooked but not yet landed. It made them hungry. It made them reckless. At home, Sarah began her part of the assault. She was relentlessly, suffocatingly cheerful. She left travel brochures for city apartments on the kitchen table. She talked endlessly about a future free from debt and stress, of new beginnings, of how brave he was for making the tough choice. Every word was a lie, a carefully chosen tool to push him toward the cage. A week later, they met at a sterile roadside diner halfway between the farm and the city. Mark was in his element, dressed in a crisp suit, a leather briefcase on the seat beside him. He slid a folder across the Formica tabletop. "I had my lawyers draw up a preliminary agreement," he said. "All business. It's a standard offer. Very generous, under the circumstances." Ethan opened it, pretending to read the dense legal text. He let his eyes glaze over, feigning confusion. He played the part of the sentimental fool perfectly. "It's just so much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every inch of this land, my grandfather's hands touched it." "Ethan, we have to be realistic," Mark said, his voice laced with impatience. "Memories don't pay the bills." And frankly, he leaned in, his voice dropping. "The value of this place has plummeted. That organic contract you lost, that was your prime asset. Without it, this is just undeveloped rural land. To be honest, my initial offer was a bit high." Ethan watched, fascinated, as the lie took shape. Mark was using the very act of sabotage he had committed as leverage to devalue the property. The audacity was breathtaking. "I've had to revise the numbers slightly to reflect the current reality," Mark continued, pointing to a figure that was 10% lower than his previous offer. "This is a rescue package, Ethan. I'm taking a huge risk." The master angler let out a little more line. Can I at least keep his old tools from the workshop?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "And my dad's old hunting rifle?" Mark's smile was a patronizing smirk. He had won. He was so sure he had won. "Of course, buddy, of course." Ethan let out a long, shuddering sigh of defeat. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Mark, you win. Let's do it." The moment the word "okay" left Ethan's lips, a frenzy of greed was unleashed. Mark became a whirlwind of activity. He immediately called his investment partners, his voice booming with triumph. "It's a done deal. We got it for a song. The idiot farmer is practically giving it away." He painted a glorious picture for them, an exclusive, multi-million-dollar golf and spa resort, built on prime land acquired for pennies on the dollar. He convinced them to go all in, to mortgage their other properties, to empty their investment portfolios. He himself went to the bank and, using the signed preliminary agreement as proof of an impending asset acquisition, secured a massive bridge loan, leveraging every last cent he had and then some. He was no longer just building a resort. He was building a monument to his own cleverness, a monument constructed entirely of debt and delusion. And he was using his investors' money for the bricks and his own arrogance for the mortar. Sarah, meanwhile, was living in the future. Her life with Julian, the penthouse, the parties, it was all so close she could taste it. She treated Ethan with the detached kindness one might show a piece of furniture that was about to be put into storage. She was the closer, the final turn of the screw. She would bring him documents to sign, her pen tapping impatiently, her smile bright and brittle. "Just this one, honey, and we're one step closer to our new life," she'd say, her eyes already looking past him, through the walls of the farmhouse and into the glittering city beyond. One evening, she brought him the final purchase agreement, a thick stack of papers that represented the culmination of her betrayal. "Mark needs this signed by tomorrow morning to finalize the loans," she said, her voice bright. "Isn't it exciting?" "It's really happening." Ethan took the pen she offered. He looked at her radiant face, so full of joy at his impending ruin. He looked down at the signature line, the black ink, a stark finality on the white page. And he looked out the window, at the dark fields lying silent under a canopy of stars. They thought this was an ending. His ending. They had no idea that he was not signing a surrender. He was signing their death warrant. A closing is a curious ritual. It is a ceremony of finality, a gathering in a sterile, airless room where stacks of paper are signed, and a life's chapter is formally concluded. The atmosphere is meant to be one of quiet satisfaction, the dignified end of a negotiation. But on this day, in a glass-walled boardroom, on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Portland, the closing was not going to be an ending. It was going to be a detonation. And the man who looked the most out of place was the one holding the detonator. Mark had chosen the location himself, the offices of his high-powered law firm. The room was a monument to his ego, with a vast mahogany table polished to a mirror's shine and a panoramic view of the city he believed he was conquering. He was dressed for victory in a tailored charcoal suit, his smile as sharp and predatory as the crease in his trousers. Eleanor was there, a regal ice queen presiding over the proceedings, her expression one of supreme satisfaction. And Sarah was radiant. She wore a cream-colored dress that cost more than the farm's monthly profits, and she sat beside Ethan, her hand resting on his arm in a grotesque parody of wifely support. Her eyes were gleaming, not with love, but with the brilliant, hard shine of avarice. She was already mentally spending the money, furnishing the penthouse, booking the flights. Ethan was the ghost at this feast of his own demise. He wore a simple, clean work shirt and jeans, clothes that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light of the room rather than reflect it. He sat hunched in his chair, his gaze fixed on the table, the picture of a man resigned to his fate. Mark's lawyer, a man with a bland, forgettable face and an expensive watch, slid the final stack of documents across the table. "And this, Ethan, is the deed of title," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Once you sign here, ownership of the 270-acre Miller property is transferred to Thorne Development Holdings." Mark leaned forward, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "It's the right thing to do, Ethan, the best thing for everyone." Sarah squeezed his arm. "Our new life, honey," she whispered, her voice a silken lie. The lawyer uncapped a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen and placed it in front of Ethan. "Right here, Mr. Miller," he said, tapping a manicured finger on the signature line. "And then we're all done." The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 42 floors below. This was the moment. The culmination of all their plans, their whispers, their betrayals. Ethan looked at the paper. He looked at the pen. He looked up, his gaze moving from Mark's smug face to Eleanor's cold satisfaction, to the radiant, empty beauty of his wife. A strange, unreadable expression flickered in his eyes, something that was not sadness, not defeat. He reached for the pen, his calloused fingers wrapped around its smooth, cool barrel. He lifted it, poised over the document that would sign away his past, his heritage, his grandfather's legacy. He held it there for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. And then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, he set the pen down beside the paper. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. Mark's smirk faltered. "What are you doing, Ethan? Sign the damn thing." Sarah's smile tightened at the edges. "Honey, don't drag this out." Before Mark could say another word, the heavy boardroom door swung open. It didn't creak, it moved with the silent, weighted authority of a vault. Arthur Vance strode in, his posture immaculate in a classic, perfectly tailored suit. He was followed by two associates, a man and a woman, both with the same sharp, focused intensity, both carrying identical, expensive leather briefcases. They moved to the wall and stood at ease, their presence immediately changing the balance of power in the room. Arthur walked to the table and placed his own briefcase on its gleaming surface. "Apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice calm and resonant, cutting through the stunned silence. "My name is Arthur Vance. I represent a party with a significant and competing interest in this property." Mark's lawyer sputtered. "This is a private closing." "Who are you?" Arthur ignored him, his gaze fixed on Mark. "As of this morning, my client, Ethel Springs LLC, has submitted a formal, all-cash offer for the Miller Farm to the property's lien holder, which, until an hour ago, was the bank I believe you were dealing with." He opened his briefcase and produced a single, elegantly bound document, sliding it across the table. "My client's offer is for $150 million. The number landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Sarah let out a small, strangled gasp. Mark's face went from smug to confused to a blotchy, furious red. 150? That's impossible. The land is worthless. This is a joke." Arthur's expression did not change. "On the contrary," he said, as one of his associates stepped forward and opened the second briefcase. "The land is anything but worthless, but that is a matter for another time." He gestured to the new set of documents. "What should be of more immediate concern to you, Mr. Thorne, is that Ethel Springs has also, as of 9 a.m. this morning, purchased all of your outstanding capital debt related to this development project. Your bridge loan from the bank, the private equity notes you signed with your partners. My client now owns it all, every single dollar." The trap, elegant and brutal, was now fully visible. Mark stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The full scope of the disaster was dawning on him. Not only had he lost the deal of a lifetime, but he was now catastrophically in debt to the very entity that had outmaneuvered him. "Who?" Mark finally choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. He slammed his hand on the table, his composure shattering completely. "Who the hell is Ethel Springs?" The room was utterly still. Arthur Vance said nothing. He simply turned his head, his expression one of profound respect, and looked toward the end of the table. Every eye in the room followed his gaze. Every eye fell upon Ethan. Ethan pushed his chair back and rose slowly to his feet. The slump was gone from his shoulders. The vacant look was gone from his eyes. He stood tall, grounded, a man who had been underestimated for the last time. He looked at Mark, whose face was a mask of dawning horror. He looked at Eleanor, whose icy composure had finally cracked, revealing a fissure of fear. He looked at Sarah, whose beautiful face was pale and slack with disbelief. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, calm, and carried the devastating weight of absolute victory. "I am," he said. "Ethel Springs is me." The silence that followed was the sound of three worlds breaking. It was the sound of a trap, a decade in the making, finally, irrevocably, springing shut. The boardroom had been a sealed, soundproof chamber, a private tomb for the ambitions of three people. But the truth, once unleashed, refuses to be contained. It seeped out from under the door, flowed down the elevator shafts, and spilled out onto the streets of the city. And there, it did what truth in the modern age always does. It became a story, and it became a story that spread with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. Within 48 hours, the world knew the name, Ethan Miller. The story was simply too perfect, too irresistible for the media to ignore. It was a modern-day fable, a David and Goliath narrative with a billion-dollar twist. The headlines wrote themselves. The Portland Tribune led with "From Farmer to Fortune." Oregon man discovers geological miracle. National news networks quickly followed, their helicopters circling his property like birds of prey. The billionaire in boots, a simple farmer sitting on a global power source. Business journals ran breathless analyses of the potential of Ethel Springs, while lifestyle magazines clamored for a piece of the human interest angle. Ethan became an instant folk hero, a symbol of authenticity in a synthetic world. He was the quiet man who had listened to the land instead of the naysayers, the guardian of a legacy who had been rewarded for his faith. His silence, once mistaken for simplicity, was now rebranded as wisdom. His patience, once seen as a lack of ambition, was now hailed as visionary foresight. The narrative was set in stone. He was the humble genius, the man who had outsmarted the slick city sharks. Arthur Vance, a master of both law and perception, knew they had to control this narrative. He arranged for one, and only one, televised interview, not in a sterile studio, but on the front porch of the farmhouse, the rolling hills of the property serving as a majestic backdrop. The interviewer, a famous journalist known for her sharp questions, flew in from New York, expecting to uncover a juicy family feud. But Ethan, coached by Arthur, gave her something far more powerful. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, his hands clean but still showing the ingrained lines of a lifetime of labor. He was calm, thoughtful, and profoundly dignified. "Mr. Miller," the journalist began, leaning forward, "the rumors are swirling that your own brother-in-law, Mark Thorne, tried to acquire this property from you for a fraction of its value. Can you speak to the betrayal you must have felt?" Ethan looked not at her, but out at the land. His land. "This story isn't about betrayal," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It's about heritage. It's about listening. My grandfather spent his life on this farm. He didn't have scientific equipment, but he had wisdom. He knew this place was special. He wrote about it. All I did was finally listen to what he had been saying all along." He skillfully turned every question about personal conflict into a tribute to his grandfather, every inquiry about his newfound wealth into a discussion of the responsibility that came with it. He spoke of funding scholarships for geologists, of developing the resource in an environmentally sustainable way. He was not the gloating victor. He was the reluctant, thoughtful custodian of a miracle. And the world fell in love with him for it. While Ethan's star ascended into the stratosphere, another was crashing to earth in a spectacular fiery blaze. For Mark Thorne, the public square became a pillory. The same articles that lionized Ethan mentioned Mark by name, but only as a cautionary tale. He was the punchline to the greatest business story of the year. Thorne, the billionaire's brother-in-law, was reportedly moments away from acquiring the multi-billion-dollar property for less than the cost of a luxury condo in what is now being called the most short-sighted business blunder of the decade. His name became synonymous with failure. His picture splashed across websites next to headlines about greed and incompetence. The humiliation was swift, and it was total. His investment partners, the men he had lured into his scheme with promises of grandeur, turned on him with the fury of a betrayed wolf pack. Their life savings, their children's college funds, their retirements, all of it had been leveraged against the deal, and now all of it was owned by Ethel Springs. Mark's phone rang incessantly with their rage-filled, desperate calls. "You told us he was a fool, Mark. You swore it was a sure thing. You've ruined me." But their anger was nothing compared to the cold, methodical precision of Arthur Vance. Ethel Springs LLC, as Mark's new creditor, showed no mercy. There were no negotiations, no payment plans. The notices arrived in a blizzard of legal paper. Immediate repayment of all outstanding loans is hereby demanded. Mark's world was dismantled piece by piece. His silver sedan was repossessed. His penthouse condo, with its panoramic city views, was seized and put up for auction. His company, Thorne Development, was gutted. Its assets sold off for pennies on the dollar to cover a mere fraction of the catastrophic debt he now owed Ethan. He became a ghost in the city he once thought he owned. The exclusive restaurants where he once held court would suddenly have no tables available for him. The business clubs where he once networked now fell silent when he entered a room. The members turning their backs, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. They didn't just see a man who had lost money. They saw a fool, a bungler who had been outplayed by a farmer. In their world, there was no greater sin. The irony was poetic in its cruelty. Mark, a man who had built his entire identity on the flimsy scaffolding of image and reputation, now had his image permanently shattered. He, who had worshipped money above all else, was now hopelessly, catastrophically broke. He, who had so viciously mocked Ethan's connection to the dirt, was now lower than the dirt itself. Ethan never had to speak a single word against him in public. He never had to lift a finger. He had simply constructed a mirror, and the reflection of Mark's own boundless greed had been enough to utterly destroy him. The tale of two brothers-in-law ended with two starkly different images. One was of Ethan, standing by his grandfather's stream at sunset, the golden light making the water look like liquid gold, a man at peace, in quiet command of an empire. The other was of Mark, glimpsed through the window of a dingy, rented apartment across town, staring at a final eviction notice, a man trapped in a prison of his own making, haunted by the ghost of a billion-dollar fortune he had held in his hands, and had been too arrogant to see. A house is built of wood and stone, but a home is built of trust. When the foundation of that trust is dynamited, the home ceases to exist. All that remains is a hollow structure, a collection of rooms and memories that have been rendered meaningless, a museum of a life that is over. For a week after the boardroom detonation and the ensuing media firestorm, the farmhouse was just a house. It was silent, empty of the poisonous sweetness of Sarah's presence. Ethan moved through its rooms like a ghost, his only companion, the quiet, methodical work of planning his future. He had expected her to call, to scream, to rage, but there had been nothing. Then, one afternoon, her car crunched up the gravel driveway. He watched from the kitchen window as she got out. She did not look like the radiant, triumphant woman from the lawyer's office. She looked smaller, diminished, like a soldier returning from a battle she had catastrophically lost. She had come back not to a home, but to the headquarters of the man who had conquered her world, to see if there was anything left to salvage from the wreckage. He did not greet her at the door. He waited in the kitchen, a glass of cold water in his hand, his back to the entrance as he gazed out at his fields. He heard her footsteps, hesitant on the familiar floorboards. "Ethan," she said, her voice a fragile, trembling thing he didn't recognize. He turned slowly, his face impassive. She had prepared for this. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She had dressed down, wearing an old sweater he had once liked. It was a costume, and this was her final performance. Tears began to stream down her face as she launched into her carefully rehearsed monologue. "Oh, Ethan, honey, I am so sorry," she began, her voice breaking on a sob. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just so lost, so stressed about the money, about everything. Mark and my mother. They just kept telling me you were giving up, that we were going to lose everything. They got inside my head." She took a tentative step closer, her hands outstretched. "It was never about not loving you. I always loved you. Julian, he was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake because I was scared and lonely. Please, you have to believe me. We can fix this. Remember how we used to be? We can get that back." She tried to weave a tapestry of shared memories and feigned remorse, a beautiful, intricate lie designed to snare his sympathy. She was playing the only card she had left, the ghost of the woman he had once loved. The old Ethan would have been shattered by her tears. He would have been torn apart by the mention of their shared past, but the old Ethan was dead. The man standing before her now was a geologist of the soul, and he could see every fault line, every fracture in her performance. He let her speak, his silence, a vast, unnerving canvas upon which she painted her desperation. He didn't interrupt, he didn't argue. He simply let her exhaust her supply of lies until her sobs quieted and she stood before him, waiting for his response, for his anger, for his pain, for anything but this terrible, placid calm. When she was finally finished, the silence in the room was deafening. He took a final, slow sip of his water, placed the glass on the counter, and turned to a thick manila folder that was sitting there. He picked it up and placed it on the kitchen table between them. The quiet sound of the paper on the wood was like a gunshot. "I believe," he said, his voice level and devoid of all emotion, "that this is everything we have left to discuss." Her brow furrowed in confusion. With a trembling hand, she opened the flap of the folder and looked inside. The deconstruction of her life was laid out on stark white paper. On top was the petition for divorce. It was already signed, his signature, a bold, confident stroke at the bottom of the page. It was not a proposal, it was a verdict. Her breath hitched. Beneath it were the photographs, not blurry, long lens shots, but crystal clear 8x10 glossies. There she was, laughing with Julian at a candlelit dinner, his hand resting intimately on hers. There they were, silhouetted in a hotel window, locked in an unmistakable embrace. There they were, checking into a boutique hotel in the wine country on a weekend. She had told him she was at a work retreat. The professional, dispassionate quality of the photos terrified her. Her secret life had not just been discovered, it had been documented like a scientific study. Next came the spreadsheets, pages and pages of them, meticulously prepared by Arthur Vance's forensic accountants. Every credit card statement, every bank transfer, every ATM withdrawal that didn't make sense. The highlighted lines told a damning story. The jewelry she'd claimed a friend gave her, the expensive dinners, the hotel bills, and most damningly, the steady, systematic siphoning of their joint savings account into a private one under her name only. It was the cold, mathematical blueprint of her betrayal. And finally, at the very bottom, was the document she had long forgotten, the one she had laughed at, the prenuptial agreement. He had bookmarked a page, Clause 7B. She read the cold, legalistic prose, and the last of her hope withered and died. All assets, properties, or wealth derived from inherited property shall remain the sole and separate property of the inheriting spouse. The mask shattered, the tears vanished, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, venomous fury. The penitent wife was gone, replaced by the cornered thief. "You had me followed?" she hissed, her voice low and ugly. "You did all this behind my back?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, he spoke to the stranger in his house. "You are correct," he said, his voice as cold and clear as the water in his glass. "I investigated the person who was stealing from me and betraying my trust. That person, it turns out, was my wife. Or rather, the woman who was pretending to be." He gestured to the folder. "The woman I married would never have been capable of this. The woman I loved would have talked to me about her fears, not plotted my ruin with her family. I don't know who you are, Sarah, but you are not her." He walked to the door and held it open. "The divorce is non-negotiable. The financial settlement is outlined in the prenup you so eagerly signed. You will get nothing from this land. You will get nothing from Athol Springs. You are free to go and build the life you so desperately want. But you will not build it on the ashes of mine. Please leave the keys on the counter." She stood there for a long moment, the papers spread on the table like the entrails of her failed scheme. She looked at the evidence of her lies, at the simple farmhouse she had lost, and at the man she had completely and utterly misjudged. He was no longer a simple farmer. He was a king in his own kingdom, and he had just exiled her forever. Without another word, she walked to the table, her movements stiff and brittle, took the car key off her key ring, and placed it on the counter. Then she turned and walked out of the house, and out of his life, leaving nothing behind but the silence and the cold, hard truth laid bare on the table. If Mark was the loud, crashing storm and Sarah was the insidious, rising flood, then Eleanor was the poisoned well from which they both drank. She was the source, the quiet, unshakable matriarch who had cultivated her family's culture of contempt and entitlement for decades. Her power was not in overt aggression, but in the devastating weight of her judgment, the chilling certainty of her own superiority. A week after Sarah's ignominious departure, a week of profound and cleansing silence on the farm, a pristine black sedan, the kind that whispers of old money and quiet power, purred up the driveway. Ethan watched from the window as his mother-in-law emerged. Eleanor was not dressed for a plea, she was dressed for a coronation. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her posture was ramrod straight, and she carried a $1,000 handbag as if it were an orb of state. She did not knock. She pressed the doorbell once, a short, imperious summons. Ethan opened the door and simply looked at her. He did not invite her in, but she swept past him as if he were a doorman, her expensive perfume, an invasive presence in the clean, earthy air of the house. "We need to talk," she announced, her voice leaving no room for refusal. He closed the door and led her to the living room. The room was different now, and he saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. The soft, feminine touches Sarah had added were gone. The throw pillows, the scented candles, the dozens of framed photos of their smiling, fraudulent life together, all had been removed. It was a clean, sparse, masculine space now, dominated by a large, newly framed topographical map of the farm on the wall. It was his room, in his house. The change was a quiet declaration of independence, and she felt it. He did not offer her a seat, but she took the armchair opposite the fireplace anyway, arranging herself not as a guest, but as a queen holding court. He remained standing. "I am here," she began, her voice as cold and polished as marble, "to put an end to this destructive and childish campaign of yours." She spoke as if he were a petulant teenager who had thrown a tantrum. "You have had your little moment of drama. You have made your point, but you have publicly humiliated my daughter. You have financially destroyed my son, and you have dragged our family's name through the mud. It is time for it to stop." He listened, his face an unreadable mask, his silence unnerving her more than any argument could. She pressed on, her voice gaining a sharp, scolding edge. "Marriage, Ethan, is a sacred vow. It is about weathering storms. It is about forgiveness. A man, a real man, has a duty to provide for his wife and protect his family, regardless of any minor indiscretions. What you have done is cruel, vindictive, and frankly, beneath you." She leaned forward, her eyes like chips of ice. "So this is what is going to happen. You will call your lawyer and you will stop these ridiculous divorce proceedings. You will then arrange for a proper and very generous settlement for Sarah, to compensate her for the pain and embarrassment you have caused. It is the only decent thing to do." She sat back, the finality in her tone suggesting the matter was now closed. She had issued her decree. She had defined his decency as complete and total surrender to her will. She, the architect of his misery, was lecturing him on the sanctity of the family she had tried to demolish. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, letting her pronouncements hang in the silent room. The arrogance was breathtaking. She was not here to negotiate a truce. She was here to demand the unconditional surrender of a defeated enemy, completely unaware that she was the last casualty in a war she had already lost. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Decency," he said, testing the word. "Family, forgiveness. These are powerful words, Eleanor." He reached into the pocket of his shirt and took out a small, slim, digital audio recorder. It was no bigger than a pocket knife. He placed it on the solid oak coffee table between them. "The problem is," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "your family uses words like these as weapons, as camouflage. So I thought, for once, we could listen to the words you use when you believe no one is listening." Her eyes narrowed at the sight of the small electronic device. A flicker of uncertainty, the first he had ever seen in her, crossed her face. He pressed a single button. The room, which had been silent, was suddenly filled with the faint, atmospheric sound of a torrential downpour and the clinking of wine glasses. And then, the voices. Their voices. Preserved with perfect, high-fidelity clarity. First, Mark's, smug and boastful, recounting the tale of the sabotage. Then Sarah's, light and cruel, laughing as she called him a simple fool and detailed her financial betrayal. And then, the final voice, her own. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair as her own words, sharp and venomous, echoed through the quiet living room. "The man is stubborn. He will never let go of this land out of sentiment alone. He must be broken. A man content to play in the dirt is no husband for a daughter of mine." The recording played on for another 30 seconds, a tapestry of their contempt and their plotting, before Ethan pressed the button again, plunging the room back into a silence that was now heavier, more damning than any sound could ever be. The queen had been dethroned. The blood had drained from Eleanor's face, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. Her carefully constructed facade of matriarchal authority, of moral superiority, had been utterly demolished by the undeniable truth of her own voice. She opened her mouth to speak, to justify, to explain, but no words came out. What could she say? She had been tried and convicted by an unimpeachable witness, herself. Ethan picked up the recorder and slipped it back into his pocket. He was no longer looking at a queen, but at a bitter, defeated old woman. "The family you ordered me to protect, Eleanor," he said, his voice no longer gentle, but as hard and unyielding as granite, was a fiction. "It was a business, and I was the asset you were all trying to liquidate. The marriage you spoke of was the trap, and the decency you demand is something none of you would recognize." He walked to the front door and opened it wide, letting the clean, afternoon air sweep into the room. "You will not contact me again. Sarah will communicate only through my lawyer. You will not set foot on this property again. To me, from this moment on, you are all simply ghosts from a life I no longer live. And this house," he paused, looking around the room, his room, "is no longer haunted." She rose from the chair, her movement stiff and clumsy, all her regal grace gone. She looked old, fragile, and utterly powerless. She walked past him and out the door without a word, without looking back, a monarch driven into exile. Ethan watched her get into her car and drive away, the dust from the gravel lane rising up behind her like a fading memory. He closed the door, and the solid, final sound of the latch clicking into place echoed through the house. It was the sound of the last lock on his prison being broken. It was the sound of freedom. 6 months passed. The fury of winter gave way to the tender hope of spring, and then to the full, confident bloom of summer. The seasons turned, and on the Miller farm, a transformation even more profound had taken place. The quiet, struggling piece of land was now the global headquarters of the Ethel Springs Research Institute, a state-of-the-art facility that blended seamlessly into the landscape. Glass and cedar structures sat nestled amongst the ancient oaks. Labs hummed with quiet purpose, and the once-forgotten stream was now the heart of a place dedicated to healing and discovery. Ethan was no longer just a farmer, nor was he merely a billionaire. He was a visionary, the quiet, steady man at the center of a scientific revolution. He still walked the land every morning, his boots still getting muddy, but now his companions were often Nobel laureates and leading geologists, all of them drawn to the miracle he had unearthed. He carried his power not like a weapon, but like a tool, with the same respect and care he had always given his grandfather's old equipment. He had not been corrupted by his wealth. He had simply used it to irrigate the world. News of his former life would occasionally reach him like faint, distorted echoes from a distant shore. Sarah, he heard, was working as a cashier at a high-end department store, surrounded by the luxury she craved but could no longer afford, her beauty fading under the harsh fluorescent lights of a life she despised. Her lover, Julian, had vanished the moment her financial prospects had evaporated. Mark was working on a construction crew, his soft hands now calloused and raw, his skin burned by the same sun he had once planned to build his golf courses under. He was a ghost on the lowest rungs of the industry he had once sought to dominate. And Eleanor, the queen of a fallen kingdom, lived alone in a small, downsized condo, her social circle disintegrated, her days a long, silent testament to the ruinous cost of her pride. Ethan heard this news without joy and without pity. It was simply the logical conclusion of their choices, the natural, unavoidable echo of their own actions. They were no longer a part of his world. One warm summer evening, Arthur Vance drove out to the farm, not as a lawyer, but as a friend. They sat on the front porch, the same porch where Ethan had once sat in the depths of his despair, and they shared a bottle of expensive whiskey, a toast to the final approval of a new international patent. The air was calm, filled with the scent of cut grass and the gentle sound of crickets. "You know," Arthur said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, a thoughtful look on his face. "There's one final piece of this puzzle I never shared with you. a loose end from the very beginning. Ethan turned to him, curious. I always felt that the geologist's report from Colorado was the turning point, Arthur continued. The note from that senior analyst, Dr. Finch. The sheer, unbridled enthusiasm in his assessment. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. It gave us the confidence to go all in. He was a good scientist, Ethan said. He was more than that, Arthur replied, a slow smile spreading across his face. After we had secured everything, I did a little digging, out of professional curiosity. Alistair Finch's father was a man named Robert Finch, a small, honest real estate developer. About 15 years ago, he was driven into a hostile bankruptcy and lost everything. The stress and the shame led to a heart attack that killed him 6 months later. The man who orchestrated that bankruptcy, a ruthless, ambitious young competitor who crushed him to get a piece of land for a strip mall, was Mark Thorne. Ethan sat motionless, the whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips. The pieces of a much larger, much older story were clicking into place in his mind. When your sample arrived at the lab, Arthur explained, the submission form listed the source as the Miller Farm, near Thorne County. The combination of names was evocative for Dr. Finch. He had never forgotten the name of the man who had destroyed his father. A little research confirmed that Mark Thorne was your brother-in-law. The sample was legitimate, of course. The water is every bit the miracle the report claimed. But Alistair Finch saw something more than a geological anomaly. He saw a chance for a very particular kind of poetic justice. He personally supervised every test. He fast-tracked the analysis, and he wrote that addendum with a level of emphasis that made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't just analyzing a water sample, Ethan. He was helping to load the gun that would finally avenge his father. A profound silence settled between the two men. Ethan looked out at the darkening fields, at the empire he had built on the ashes of his old life. He had thought he was a solitary general, waging a quiet, lonely war. But he saw now that he had been an unwitting soldier in a much longer campaign, an instrument of a justice that had been set in motion a decade and a half before. His personal quest for retribution was just one, final, karmic loop in a vast, intricate pattern of cause and effect. He had not acted alone. He had been aided by the ghost of a good man and the patient, watchful son who had never forgotten him. And so, the story of the simple farmer comes to its true and final close. It leaves us with a chilling and undeniable lesson. Never underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. Because in that silence, he is not healing, he is not forgetting, he is studying, he is learning the terrain of his enemy's soul. He is waiting for the perfect moment to act, not with loud, clumsy rage, but with the devastating, beautiful precision of a plan that has been perfected in the quiet, patient dark. Every family has a secret. Every betrayal has its price. What story will be unearthed next time? Join us again to find out.